Hi, I'm Lexi and this is Hannah, and we're Wild About Conservation.
This is the podcast where we explore the world of conservation through discussions with our very knowledgeable guests. This season's focus is on all things ocean.
Last week, we started by getting to know William Kay. And now, in this second part of this special, we get to know a lot more about the focus of his PhD and how he monitored the behavioural ecology of seals.
We found it super interesting talking about seals and their behaviour, and we really appreciated Will chatting to us about his work in the UK. We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast. Please remember to leave us a review, get in touch on Twitter, and if you would like to support us as creators, we do have a Patreon. Check out all the links in the show notes on our website. Enjoy!
But yeah, well, what is it about seals? Because you've got this massive broad spectrum of knowledge about them, but what is it about seals that you actually study?
So I study movements and behaviour of seals, and I study how the movements and behaviour of seals changes in response to different drivers. So things like environmental drivers, it could be tidal currents, it could be changes in tidal height, it could be changes in temperature, or even the absence or presence of different predator species or conspecifics. But I tend to study movements because movements are fundamental to anything and everything an animal does. If you just think yourselves, think of anything that you do at all. It could be going to the shop to buy food. It could be sleeping. It could be literally anything that you do involves some type of movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would you disagree?
Yeah.
Or
no, I am completely with you here. I'm nodding my head, and even that's a movement. So yeah, I'm with you.
Everything involves movement, and so if you can study movement, then you can and you can infer behaviour from movement. Then you can learn a huge amount about what animals do. So there's all sorts of other things that you could study for seals. You could study their genetics. You could study their physiology. All of these really important subjects. But if you want to learn about what seals do, then studying movements is sort of the way to do that. And I study or have studied those things with animal tracking devices. So we stick little devices on the seals and we track where they go, and they tell us all sorts of things about how the animals move, where the animals are, how deep they are, even just their posture, if they're lying on their back, if they're lying on their stomach, if they're turning to the left or to the right. So really fine scale stuff. And I use these tracking devices to determine where they go and what they're doing, and how they might be affected by threats, things like marine renewable energy installations.
These tracking devices that you use, Will, do they just measure, as you said, they can measure orientation, if they're resting, where the seals are going? Do they also take environmental data, so temperature, salinity, any of these kind of things? But obviously a seal's moving so fast that getting stable readings might be a problem.
It's not always a problem. Actually, some of the tags have extremely high what's called sampling resolutions. So they can take data at something ridiculous, like 800 times a second is one of the fastest recording devices that I've ever heard of. And that's probably underestimating some of the ones out there that I don't know about. But generally speaking, we record data at what's called 40 hertz. Hertz just means times per second. So 40 times a second we collect data on the animals. And these loggers, they're called multi-sensor loggers. Excuse me, and they're one of the most advanced loggers that we have out nowadays. And technology has come on leaps and bounds in the last sort of few decades. And these devices can tell us, a lot about the environment. So they will take things like salinity, light, humidity, temperature, depth. So they have a pressure gauge that you convert to depth. So they can tell you all about where the animal is, but they will also tell you all about the animal movement as well. So they'll record GPS positions every time the animal comes to the surface. They'll record what's called accelerometry, which is essentially the acceleration in the three different directions. So up and down, left and right, forwards and back. And they also record magnetometry, which is the relative magnetic field strength of the tag in real time. So that will tell you how the animal's moving, the heading that the animal is going in, and also it can tell you a bit about where the animal is, because magnetic field strength or magnetic field intensity changes around the globe. So you can get some simple indication of where the animal is based on that. So yeah, most of these tags, they have at least sort of something like 12 to 16 channels, different channels of data that they collect in real time.
I'm just blown away by the amount of technology that you use, because when we were chatting before, and we know that you do work with seals and stuff, I understand what biologging equipment is, but could you give me like a bit more of an overview and how many different trackers have you used in throughout your PhD?
Yeah, biologging equipment is super varied. Just for your listeners, biologging just means collecting biological information about an animal. So it might be you can actually get some really wacky devices, things like blood samplers. So there are devices that are attached to seals that have internal parts. So they actually go into the veins. They're sort of glued on the back of the seals, and then they have an internal part that goes into the veins and will take some blood. And what it's doing is it tracks the animal's dive depths, and then it takes blood samples in real time. And I don't know if it's sampled on board or whether you have to collect the tag afterwards, because I've not worked with these myself, but this is just an extreme example. It tells you about how much sort of lactic acid is built up in the blood, and it tells you a lot about the metabolic effects of diving. So there's some really, really weird and wonderful tags out there. I guess the most simple ones, or the ones that I've used most, are GPS devices. So just like what you have in your phone, the same technology that you use to use your sat-nav, Google Maps on your phone, we use to track animals. So there's this global positioning system, GPS system, which consists of about 30, I think it is, satellites orbiting the globe at any one time. And the device acts as a receiving unit. So the GPS satellites are actually transmitting information down to Earth, and the GPS device receives that information in the form of a radio message, a radio frequency. And if you imagine a GPS device placed on the Earth's surface, if it has a message and it's received that message from maybe 3 or 4 different satellites, then it can triangulate the position. It works out where those messages have come from, when they were received, and it works out how it triangulates its position, so it works out where the animal is. So those are the ones that tend to be most commonly used. You can also use very high frequency radio transmitters, which are just like you use to make calls between boats out at sea, a radio transmission, which you can. They were developed mainly for tracking birds back in the mid-1900s. They started to be developed for tracking birds. So you can take a handheld receiver, and if you point it in the right direction, when a VHF transmitter is pinging, sending out its radio transmission, then you can detect that ping. And if you detect a series of pings, and you can start to work out which direction the animal is headed off in. That's particularly tricky for a seal, and we don't really use that technology to track the animal in real time, but we might use radio transmitters when a device is detached from the animal and is now floating at the water surface to send out a position that we can track to relocate the tag. And then finally, we have something called, penultimately, there's another one after this. Penultimately, we have a spot transmitter, or a satellite position only transmitter, which is essentially a VHF transmitter, but sends a transmission at a much higher frequency and can actually send a transmission up to a satellite that's orbiting about 400 kilometers above the Earth. And that works essentially like the GPS tag, but in reverse. So this tag is actually sending the transmission as opposed to receiving the transmission. And it's the satellite that receives the transmission. And if you send a series of transmissions to a series of satellites, then those satellites can triangulate the position of the tag. So there's all sorts of transmitters. And then there's also the one I alluded to earlier with like the 16 channels of data. That's what we call an archival tag. And that is a tag that collects so much data that it must store it on board. And it tends to store it on, just like you find in your phone, a micro SD card, usually one that has an enormous amount of data, so something like 64 or 128 gigabyte SD card. And you store all that data on board, and then you have to find a way to recover the tag. And actually, it's the recovery of the tag, at least in my case, that's been the most tricky part of the process.
I can imagine that all of this tag development and everything that's changed, and also it's just hopefully getting easier to develop these tags with kind of the use of Raspberry Pi and coding and people being able to build their own kind of equipment. You mentioned earlier about cow ear tags and how they can be used as a flipper tag. And I mean, if we think about our pets, people tag their pets, people put microchips in them.
Yeah.
I imagine going from the kind of, just an individual ID tag, like a flipper tag, to the kind of data you're talking about, that in the last 50 years, our data resolution has changed massively. And is that kind of, did we just used to really have presence absent data? And is that a challenge when you look at historical data because there is so much less resolution, I guess?
Yeah, gosh, there's a lot in that question. I guess for your
we don't
listeners,
do things by half.
No, definitely not. For your listeners, a good thing to think about is the history, I suppose, of tag development. It's a really nice story, actually, and as I alluded to earlier, in the sort of mid 1900s, the radio transmitters was the key thing, and they were used for tracking birds. The first time a seal was ever tagged was in the 1950s by a chap called Gerald Kooijman. He's known as sort of the pioneer of seal research, and he tagged a Weddell seal with a time depth recorder. And as the name suggests, it recorded time and depth. So it just gave you what's like a 2D dive profile, which you could learn about how much time the animal spends at depth, but you don't really know much about what the animal did underwater. You can find out little bits based on that 2D trajectory, but you don't have the fine scale movements. And it was a really cool piece of kit because it was completely custom built. It was actually it had a rotating disc with a kitchen timer. Rotating disc, and it had a small pin that would sort of, as the animal went deeper and the pressure increased, the pin would push further into a smoked glass disc, and it would etch in a little scratch, if you like, in the disc surface. And then when the animal came back, and the Gerald Kooijman was very savvy, and he cut a big hole in the ice, and the seal had to come back to that hole, so he was always able to get the tag back. And he would take the tag off, and then he would look at the trace, and he would actually trace it on like a piece of trace paper or parchment paper, and look, and that would be the data that he would use to study how this seal dived and how deep it went, dependent, made the pin scratch even deeper into the smoked glass disc. So you could actually generate like this spiral. It would spin around like a spiral with the kitchen timer. This 2D or profile. It was a really elegant little cool piece of kit. So that was like in the 1950s. In the 1970s, the advent of Argos satellites came into force, mainly for the space industry, but was used by animal trackers, first in the 1980s then, to track animals. And so the first Argos tag, we got data back from an animal in the 1980s. And the 1980s also saw sort of a rapid development in the miniaturization of tags, which meant that we could tag ever-growing number of species, smaller species. The 1990s saw a really rapid acceleration in the development of microprocessors and batteries as well. And batteries are still a limiting factor even now in terms of their size. But back in the 1980s and 1990s, you remember the huge mobile phones. Batteries were much bigger back then, and so the 1990s saw this improvement in the reduction of battery size. And also the advent of the GPS satellite system, which is, far supersedes the resolution of the Argos satellite system. One issue for seals and other marine mammals is the fact that they don't spend much time at the surface. So they're very fleetingly observed at the surface. And so if an animal comes to the surface, the GPS device has to receive these transmissions, right, at the surface. And so if the animal isn't at the surface for long enough, it can't receive those transmissions. And so in the 2000s, in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, something called FastLock GPS was developed. FastLock meaning fast location acquisition, and it just means that when the animal comes to the surface, and the tag used to be typically tagged on the seal's head, but nowadays more so on the sort of shoulder blades. When the animal breaches the water surface, these FastLock GPS devices can now sort of get a snapshot of where the animal is, slightly lower resolution or accuracy than the GPS devices. But within sort of less than a quarter of a second, these tags can determine where that animal is on the Earth's surface. So it's a phenomenal piece of kit. And yeah, ever since then, we've just gone from strength to strength. So we've had, particularly in the last couple of decades, we've had an absolute surge in the number of movement ecology studies using these biologging devices to track animals. And so that's, we're in a much better place now to track animals than we were, even 10, 15 years ago. And we've now got things like the Icarus satellite system, which is a satellite system that's been developed especially for tracking animals. The key reason it's up there now in space is for tracking animals. And we have a whole host of Icarus satellite tags. Some of the smallest satellite tags you can find now. A really cool piece of work sort of led by a guy called Professor Martin Wikelski at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. And so that's a really groundbreaking and exciting area for animal tracking. And then you mentioned about using sort of old data, and you're right. It is, you are limited in what you can do with things like flipper tags. So flipper tags can tell you sort of where the animal's been and where the animal might end up, but it gives you no idea necessarily about how the animal got from A to B. And so, in order to learn about that, the only way really you can do it is to do some modelling and to make some predictions and to try to estimate, based on what we know now, what those animals may have done years ago, and how they may have got got between position A and position B. But you can, and a couple of chapters of my PhD has been using these old data to try to learn about how seals might disperse. So when the pups are born, and after they've weaned from their mothers, they disperse, and they have actually some very far-ranging dispersal. They can disperse, many hundreds of kilometres in the first months of life. And actually, the furthest I saw was a seal that left Pembrokeshire and reached the north coast of Spain, some 964 kilometres within 3 months. So, to travel that distance in 3 months under your own power is pretty impressive already. But to do that when you've literally just been born and those 3 months are your first 3 months of life is even more impressive. It's just, it blows my mind to think that a pup just 3 months old can achieve something like that. They're really amazing animals. And so even with these old data, we now have far more sophisticated statistical methods and analytical methods that we can use now and we can employ on these old data to try and learn more from these old data that we weren't able to in the past. So there are limitations, but there are always more new ways, new sort of ideas about how we can use these old data to extract as much from them. And some of the historical data are actually some of the most important. The historical data I looked at in my PhD were from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And of course, the marine environment has changed massively since then in terms of anthropogenic installations, offshore renewables, coastal renewables, obviously climate change and habitat loss and habitat changes. We know from the seagrass work, we just published a paper, not me specifically, but the research team I work with published a paper just yesterday, which showed that we've lost 90% of the UK's seagrass. So it's, the environment has changed. So having those historical data is essential to know how these animals their behaviour might have changed over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. So have you ever had to design any tech for your research yourself? And if you have, do you have to take animal welfare and data retrieval into consideration, and how does that work? It seems really difficult because, like you say, you're putting these tags onto marine mammals which can travel a ridiculous amount of distance, and you may never see that tag again.
Yeah, it is very, very difficult, a real logistical challenge. And certainly at the beginning of my PhD, I would not have thought for a second that I was an engineer. That's not really my expertise. But at the end of the PhD, I sort of had to become, by the end of the PhD, I should say, I had to become one. So, the trouble with the tags that we use at Swansea University is they're these very high resolution tags. So they collect this enormous amount of data. And if you were to want to retrieve that data, some tags can transmit data to satellites. But if you want to transmit the sheer volume of data that we tend to collect, which is, it could be, if you imagine an Excel spreadsheet, I guess most of your listeners will be familiar with an Excel spreadsheet. If you imagine an Excel spreadsheet with, like, say, 40 columns and 1 million rows, and each of those cells are filled with a number, that's sort of 1 million rows actually nowadays is quite a small data set. Most of the data I was working with were tens of millions of rows of data. So it's an absolutely phenomenal amount of data. that you can get from an animal within the space of 2 weeks, maybe a couple of months. And transmitting all of that data via satellite is just not possible. The raw data. You can transmit summaries, and there are developments being made in what's called data abstraction, where you actually collect a load of data on board. The tag then processes the data and then sends summaries to the satellites. But even that still requires quite a lot of power. And you're limited in what you can learn from that because you're not actually able to access the raw data, and you can do so much more with the raw data. And so if you want to recover that raw data, you need to recover the tag. And obviously, as you've alluded to, recovering a tag from a seal that might be 100 kilometers offshore is not an easy thing to do. And so you need to build some sort of device that you can retrieve remotely. So that was really a key challenge that faced me at the beginning of my PhD, was how am I going to track the location of this animal, track everything that it's doing, and recover the tag afterwards. And so what I opted for, and again, it's a work in progress. A PhD is a project that you do your best with, but you never quite achieve everything that you want to do. And after the PhD, you still have so much more to achieve. And we'll see what my examiners say of it at the end of the month. But what I opted to do was to combine 3 different devices into one tag. And those devices were a fast lock GPS, a daily diary, which is this 16-channel archival data logger, the one that cannot send the data. So I needed to recover that. The fast lock GPS was it transmitted to a local base station, but of course, if your seal doesn't go anywhere near that local base station, then you don't get the data. So let's assume that we wanted to recover that as well. And then we had either a VHF transmitter or a spot transmitter, the satellite transmitter. And that was really only there for the tag to transmit its position for us, the scientists, to receive it, to relocate it. So you have to build a device that can do all of these things. And when you stick it on the animal, it stays on the animal for the time that you want it to. It comes off the animal at the time that you want it to. It's robust, so it doesn't take any damage. These seals, especially grey seals, they haul out on very pebbly, rocky beaches, and they weigh up to 300 kilos. So if they roll over and squish your tag, then your tag's got to be pretty indestructible. Seals can dive to 100 meters, so it needs to be able to withstand pressure at depth as well. So there's all these factors, just for the tag to be robust. But there's also streamlining is super important. Seals have evolved over millennia to be very hydrodynamic and to reduce the drag that they experience underwater. And if you stick a bulky tag on the back of a seal, then you're really hampering its ability to move efficiently through the water. So you have to make sure that the tag is streamlined as well as being everything else that I've just listed. So you stick this tag on an animal. That tag has to be streamlined. It has to be positioned in a certain place for when the animal breaches the surface to be able to transmit or receive signals from satellites. And then when it comes off the animal, it needs to be able to orientate itself in the right way to transmit its position so that you can go and relocate it. Yeah, so the key challenge really is developing a tag that can do all of these things, is robust enough to withstand damage, but also collects the data that you actually want it to, and then comes off at the right time that you can then go and retrieve it. And we used what's called a galvanic link. So it's a small piece of magnesium that corrodes, and depending on the quality and the size of the magnesium link, that will determine how long it takes for that link to corrode. So we were trialing different links to make sure that this tag comes off at the right time. But of course, you've also got to remember the fact that seals haul out, and this link only corrodes when it's in water. So the seal might haul out for, let's say, 20% of its time. So you have to factor that into the calculation when you're trying to predict when this tag will fall off. So it's a real engineering challenge, and I worked with a lot of technicians and other engineers during my PhD to build this device. And we managed to tag seals in Germany, harbour seals in Germany, and also grey seals in Pembrokeshire in Wales with these devices. We had a lot more success with the harbour seals, I think mainly because they are a smaller species, and they tend to live on, or at least in the Wadden Sea, they're on sandy sediments. So if they roll over and they squish the tag sort of gets a bit buried in the sand but won't really take much damage. Whereas the much larger grey seals that haul out in these rocky beaches, I think the tag was probably not quite as indestructible as it needed to be. I combined all of these 3 different units in a housing that was printed in 3D, and it was printed with a biodegradable plastic. So if we lose the tags, they won't necessarily degrade very quickly, but they will degrade at some point over time. And so hopefully we're not polluting the environment as well in the process of doing this work. So yeah, it was a real challenge to build a tag like this, and we had some successes. We had quite a few failures as well, but that's science, and that's the process of development. So we've got a lot more ideas, and I have a lot more ideas to develop this tag further.
That is absolutely mind-blowing that you were like, yeah, I'm just going to go make my own tag. I need a little bit of this one, a little bit of that one, and then let's just go and try it out. But as you've mentioned, it's a lot of work and a lot of time behind that as well.
Yeah, and you're on a budget as well, because these tags are, I mean, if you wanted to buy one that was sort of off the shelf, there's a lot of commercial tag manufacturers out there. There's Wild Bites Technologies, there's Wildlife Computers, there's Surtrack, there's loads of different manufacturers.
Mm-hmm.
You can buy a tag off the shelf, and some of these tags will cost you about £10,000. And so if you want to tag 10 seals, and you need to tag a certain number of them to learn enough about the population, because seals have so much what's called individual variation. The animals aren't all the same. They might be the same size, they might be the same sex, they might be the same age, but they're still very different. They have all their own individual idiosyncrasies and different personalities. Some might be more bold, some might be more timid than others. And so you need to tag a number of them to learn about the population and to start being able to make predictions of other individuals, because you have to account for that variation. And so if you wanted to tag 10 animals, then you're talking $100,000 just for the tags, and you might not get those back. And you've got the cost involved of the boats and the time and the staff that you have to pay to go out and actually deploy these things and then recover them. It's an absolutely huge task to do that. And that was the logistical side of things was as much the challenge as the research side of things for my PhD. And so building my own tag meant that I could keep things a little bit cheaper. The tags that I built came in at about £3,500 each, and they included, as I said, 3 different actual devices: the satellite transmitter, the GPS device, and the daily diary. But yeah, combining all of those in a housing that floats, is streamlined, is robust, it's just it took many months of design and going around and around in circles and checking buoyancy and things like buoyancy as well. If the tag is too buoyant, then it will impede the animal as well. So you have to make sure the tag's buoyant enough to float, but not so buoyant that it starts dragging your animal to the surface. So it's a real balance.
I was laughing, sorry, I shouldn't laugh, not funny, about the idea of a seal floating to the surface because someone's tag was far too buoyant.
It's not very realistic, to be fair.
No, but it's
seals
still
have a lot of buoyancy anyway, but you just want to make sure you're not adding loads of buoyancy.
I'm really glad you clarified on kind of how they stick and how they pop off, because that was going to be my next question, but you got there with these magnesium links that degrade over time.
Yeah,
but then
the main tag is glued actually with super glue to the seal's fur. Yeah. So you have, or what I have is we used a base plate. We glue a little base plate onto the tags, onto the seal's fur, and then the tag clips into that base plate with this galvanic release. And seals molt every year. So the tag will come off, and the base plate is a really thin piece of biodegradable plastic, and it's quite flexible, so it allows the seal still to move a little bit. And it's not big. You're talking maybe something the size of just a bit bigger than the computer mouse. And when the seal molts, then that base plate will come off as well.
Right, okay. I've got that image in my head quite firmly now. And as well, the other thing that popped into my head was we've been talking about the seals and the weight of the seals, but am I right in thinking that maybe elephant seals are the biggest seals on Earth? And how, has anyone tagged those? And if they rolled over on their tag, what that would mean?
Yeah, people have tagged elephant seals, and you're right, they are some of the largest. So they can grow to about 3.5 tons. The southern elephant seal, and they can be about 5 meters long. So absolutely enormous animals. And I mean, the hardest part, surely, I would think, is catching these things, right? Imagine a 3.5 ton animal that you've got to catch and restrain somehow, and maybe anesthetize, and then stick a tag on. And what people do is they use these things called hoop nets. They're like, imagine an ice cream cone, and where the ice cream bit would normally be, there's 2 long strings, and there's a one person or maybe two people on each end of the two strings, and you start really far in front of the seal, and then you approach the seal with these strings pulled out and the ice cream cone waiting to catch the animal. And as I said, when seals are approached on land, they more often than not, they tend to flush into the water. They tend to think, right, water, that's my safe place. I'll rush into the water. And they just rush forwards, and you've got to try and position the net in the right place, and you catch the animal in the net, and then you have to just restrain it. And it's, that's hard enough with a 300 kilo grey seal, let alone an animal that's 10 times the size of that, 3,000 kilos. It's insane.
I honestly couldn't imagine how difficult that must be.
Yeah.
But no, you've mentioned that you had to do a bit of engineering in your time as a PhD student, and you've obviously had the support of your supervisors and stuff. But would you be able to tell us about the collaborations that you've had with scientists and professionals to, really overcome some of these barriers that you've mentioned and the challenges of your PhD?
Yeah, absolutely. I would not have been able to have done any of this without help from a huge amount of people. And right at the start of my PhD in 2016, January, I went up to St Andrews, the University of St Andrews, where they have the Sea Mammal Research Unit, which is, without doubt, the leading institution for marine mammal research in the world. And the people up there are so generous with their time and such experts that, and I worked with them, throughout the PhD, not only on the ground, actually catching seals and doing the field work, but also just talking to them about the tags that they deploy, how they deploy them, the technology, what we use, the data that we collect. So the Sea Mammal Research Unit, and in particular, Dr. Matt Carter and Simon Moss, who is the lead technician there that does all the seal catching, they were both super helpful always. I also worked with the guys in Germany at the Institute of Terrestrial and Aquatic Wildlife in Hanover. And we have between Swansea University and that institute, we have a long-standing collaboration through Professor Rory Wilson and Professor Ursula Siebert, who is a veterinary marine mammal vet out in Germany. And so we work with them to do a lot of the harbour seal tagging. Two people, Dr. Abbo van Neer and Mr. Dominic Nashstein, I have to give a shout out to, because they've both been not only fantastic collaborators, but really, really good friends. And I've made such good friends with them over the last few years. And Dr. Abbo has just finished his PhD about a year or so ago, I think, and Dom is now working on his as well. Also on seals, they both work on seals. And so catching the harbour seals, I would always fly out to Germany and take the tags. Going through the airport with the tags was quite a mission as well, because you're carrying these basically a box of electronics with handmade. Right, we built these tags with little floats that are made of fiberglass resin and catalysts that have to set, and they smell funny. They're very sort of odd looking. To be perfectly honest, they do look like sort of explosive, like cement C4 type explosive material. And I had to always take like very official documentation with me through the airports, and had to arrive, normally you have to arrive at least a couple of hours before your flight. Well, I was normally around 4 hours at minimum before my flight, because sometimes it took me so long to get through security and all the alarms would go off on all the airports. And, so I'd always go out to Germany with these tags, and you're walking around in the airport thinking, I've got, probably about £20,000 worth of equipment in my rucksack here. And so those are the guys in Germany. And then in Swansea, I did a lot of collaborating with the aerospace engineers, actually, Dr. Ben Evans and Dr. David Nauman, who, and two undergraduate students, also Simon Withers and Hannah Bowen, who helped me to design my tags in terms of their shape and their hydrodynamics. Because at the beginning of my PhD, obviously, I wanted to tag these seals. I wanted to learn about them. But I wanted to try and overcome this catch-22, which is, we want to track these animals and we want to learn what they do. But if we tag the animals with a really bulky device, then we're actually biasing our own data, right? We're changing if you like, the movement speeds that these animals can achieve. And you might even restrict how far they can go and all these different things. So you want to try and make a device that has the least impact as possible. And so when I started the PhD and I started designing this device, I thought, you know what, I'm not an aerospace engineer. I'm not even an engineer. So, I'm a biologist. I need to work with the right people to learn how to make this tag as minimal impact as possible. And that's why I roped in the aerospace engineers. And we worked together on a publication that came out November 2019, which is my first first author publication, which I was super pleased with David working closely with me to design this tag. And we did we used a virtual design tool, which is used usually to design things like Formula One cars and spacecraft. It's called computational fluid dynamics. It's in the simple way of explaining it is it tells you how much drag an object moving through air or through water might have. And it's all based on simulations. And so we got some 3D models produced of our tag and of the seals, and then we modelled the drag impact that this tag would have in various different positions along the seal, and also if the tag was different size or different shape. And we tried to minimise the impact that way. So I've worked with so many different people, and that's been one of the real pleasures of the PhD, is working with so many people and travelling to so many different places to do so.
And that's the fabulous thing, I think, about all of these different places that you've worked, all this different data that you've collected, and you've already kind of hinted at some of the ways you've been using this data. But how are the findings of your PhD and the data you've been collected, how can that be related to the management of marine space, and who are seals sharing their marine space with?
Well, that's the key question, isn't it? That's why we do these things, really. We're trying to learn what impact different things might have on these seals. My PhD, the central sort of issue is marine renewable energy. And I'm all for marine renewable energy. I think it's definitely the best way to generate clean electricity and to offset these carbon emissions that are causing climate change. Mm-hmm. But naturally, anything you place in the marine environment will potentially have an impact on the species that live there. And I suppose over the years, with the development of offshore wind farms and some different marine renewable energy structures, tidal turbines and the like in Scotland and some in Ireland, and now some being developed in Wales as well, we have the threat of potential collision risk, or we have displacement potential. So seals might decide that the area or it might actually be that the prey species that the seals normally target choose not to be in those areas because of the marine renewable energy devices, and so the seals have to relocate to forage. So they share their space with obviously these industrial developments from humans. They also share their space with boats. Generally speaking, seals aren't too at risk from boats, not like whales. You tend to hear a lot about ship strike with whales. Whales tend to get hit a lot by boats, and whales tend to be a lot more susceptible to damage to their really, really sensitive sonar systems. They use, they echolocate, and so these big military sonar vessels can have really, really bad implications for echolocating dolphin and whales. Seals not so much, and ironically, things like acoustic deterrent devices have been used in these salmon farms to try to encourage seals to stay away from the salmon farms, but actually they found that the seals just use them to home in on where the salmon is. So the acoustic devices aren't really that useful against seals. One of the big risks that people still perceive to be the case is collision risk. And certainly the natural resource legislators in Wales and in England and all across the UK, when these industries want to build marine renewable energy devices, they have to meet these consenting issues. They have to meet consenting targets. So it might be that the natural resource legislators say to them, well, you have to show evidence of whether these devices will be negatively impact the seals. And so that's where we come in. We tag these seals and we learn what they do under different tidal conditions, and we try to predict what might be the impact of these marine renewable energy devices. And so things like the dispersal work that I did in the first few chapters of my PhD will tell us a bit more about how quickly these pups disperse from their natal sites, and therefore how young these animals might be and how vulnerable therefore they might be when or if they encounter these devices offshore. So I was actually modelling the spatial distribution of seals over time, and so what I learned was that actually pups can disperse very soon after weaning, or even sooner after birth, and that might mean that these pups who are very small, very naive, very vulnerable, could be encountering these turbines at a very early stage in their life, but also that the the number of pups that encounter these turbines obviously changes as the breeding season progresses. So in peak pupping season, where you tend to get the most pups born in a space of about 30 days, 1 month, there's probably about 80% of the year's pups born in that time. And so if there was any 1 month that marine renewable energy installations might want to be more or undertake more mitigation strategies to try to reduce the potential impact, then my research sort of helps them to determine what time or what month might be the most appropriate time to do that. So yeah, those are just a couple of examples, but there's all sorts of ways that these data can be related to the management of marine space. You've just got to think of them and apply them in the right way.
That all sounds excellent, and I think it just goes to show how the science that is going on with PhDs, that maybe it seems really, really niche and really, really narrowed down to a certain point, but the applications are really far-reaching, and I guess it doesn't end with your PhD. It like Swansea University is going to carry on. I imagine you're still going to help out because you seem like the type of person that can't not. But could you tell us, are there any citizen science projects around seals that people could get involved with, or like what could people do to get involved or help in different ways?
Yeah, for sure. For seals, I mean, they don't need a huge amount of protection. There's already quite a lot of protection in place. One of the things that I think disturbs the public most is the fact that we still, except for Scotland, in the rest of the UK, fishermen are still allowed to shoot seals if they approach their fish, and if they, especially like salmon farms, they're allowed to shoot seals to keep them away from the fish, and that's I think that's tragic. I don't think we're in their territory, and I don't think we should be preventing them from getting those fish. But there's livelihoods on the line as well for these fishermen, so it's a really delicate situation. But there's always petitions online that you can get involved in if you're against those sorts of things. You can write to your MPs and ask them to change the law. The law changed recently in Scotland. I believe it was June in 2020. The law changed, so now in Scotland they're not allowed to shoot seals anymore. So that's a good progress, and they need to find other ways to protect their fish against seals. They need to improve the infrastructure that house these fish, and that's important anyway, because these salmon farms are an absolute hub for genetic homogeneity. So they're really low diversity, which means that any diseases that come into these salmon farms can wipe out huge amounts of the population, but also affect the wider wild population as well. So keeping the farmed fish separate to the wild fish is super important anyway. And so I think there should be much more pressure on fisheries to do that than just to shoot the seal. Shooting the seal is a very simplistic and not particularly proactive solution, and very much a reactive thing that doesn't really solve the issue. One thing for seals, as I sort of touched upon earlier, is always spread the message to not get close to them. So if you see people approaching them, try and have a polite conversation and say, explain to them why seals should be left alone. Keep your dogs on leads nearby. Don't try and put pups back into the water, and call the right people. Things that people like the British Divers Marine Life Rescue you can volunteer with, and if you don't want to volunteer with them, then you can at least call them and let them know about seals on the beach. Another good organisation is the Sea-Watch Foundation. There's often internships with the Sea-Watch Foundation, and you can contribute in ways like recording sightings of marine mammals, dolphins, porpoise and seals as well. Trying to think what others now, really. The Marine Conservation Society is always a good one. They tend to be more, they look more holistically at the marine environment, things like plastic pollution, than I guess individual species, but certainly the Marine Conservation Society is always a good one to think about for internships or volunteering opportunities. I think that's probably the most that I know about for now.
Yeah, that's a really nice broad spectrum of options, I think, for people.
Yeah, I completely agree. Lots of things to think about. So, Will, we kind of picked up on it anyway earlier with the way that you actually attach these tags. And I can imagine that's a pretty hands-on job, catching a seal. So how do you actually do that? And also considering the seal's welfare as well?
Yeah, a very important question. It's obviously not a elegant thing to do. Seals don't want to be caught, and they're not easy to be caught, and they will try and get away. And we have to be mindful of the animal's welfare in everything that we do, and take an ethical approach if we can. So it is a process that involves a lot of disturbance. So these seals haul out in large numbers, so you'll never be able to disturb only a small number of them. You tend to disturb quite a lot of them at one time, and so you tend to do things or at least in Germany, we did things in very large groups. So we would have about 20, maybe even 25 members of staff, and a few boats, all working in one big go to try and catch as many of them as possible, so that we only had to disturb them once. And so you tend to, on a sandy beach, that at least you would have a very large seine net, just a very long net, about 200 meters long, 10 meters tall, and you would deploy that net from 2 boats. And try and surround, if you like, the haul out site, or the water immediately adjacent to a haul out site. And all the seals, as soon as they see you coming, they make a break for it into the water, and they get trapped up in the net. And so you then have to, all 20, 25 of you have to jump onto the beach and start hauling this net in. And I'm about 80 kilos, right? And if you're catching 20 odd harbour seals, which are each 140 kilos, maybe 100 kilos, then they're not small animals, so you need a lot of people, a lot of strength to be able to haul in these nets. And the priority is making sure that you get the net in fast enough so that the animals don't get too entangled or potentially drown in the nets. And it very, very, very rarely happens. So that is a great track record for that. And so then when the animals are on the beach, you tend to process them in pairs, and you tend to process them as quickly as possible. And generally speaking, the animals aren't handled for any more than about 20 minutes, and then they're released back into the sea. It's interesting that in Germany, we don't tend to anaesthetize or sedate animals, whereas in the UK, animals tend to be sedated for the work that they do. And there's pros and cons to both of those. Not sedating the animal is good, because you're not pumping it full of drugs, but at the same time, the actual restraint of the animal can be a bit more stressful, and also tagging the animals can be a bit more difficult, because these animals generally, when you much like horses, if you put a cover over their eyes, they tend to calm down quite a lot. The same can be said for seals. When you cover their heads with like a wet cloth, or you cover their eyes, they tend to calm down a bit more. And so you can do that, and when you're restraining them, then you cover their eyes, and it takes a couple of people to restrain them, but they tend to calm down. And then once they're calm, that's when you try and tag them, because you want to try and get this tag in the right place. Conversely, when you sedate them, there's much less stress, but it does take them a bit longer to come round from that sedative. And there's always the risk that if you put some sedation into them and you don't quite sedate them enough, then they could escape, and then you've essentially just caught a seal, sedated it, and then let it go again, which is never a good thing to do. So there's huge risks, and this work is never done lightly. Everything has approval from the Home Office. We need project licenses. We also need personal licenses. So I have a license to do this work, and we always have vets on site to make sure that we only tag healthy individuals. Ideally, we only catch healthy individuals as well, although the catching is quite non-selective. And that all the equipment is there. When we sedate animals, if for any reason the sedation is too heavy and the animals might actually pass out, again, that happens extremely rarely, but in case it does, we have all the equipment on site to be able to intubate the animal and make sure the animal breathes and everything else. And seals are a particularly challenging case for sedation, because they have what's called this dive response, or the dive reflex. So when they're stressed, or when they want to escape, they have a dive response. And what they do is, much like when they're diving, they slow their heart rate right down and their blood pressure drops. And that's to conserve oxygen. And they do that when they're diving. It's actually a natural response. It's a reflex action. And that's what enables them to stay underwater for so long. They're remarkable animals. Their physiology is absolutely incredible. But the problem with, obviously, animals slowing their heart rates down and dropping their blood pressure is, if you then put in more sedative and you slow their heart rate down even more, and you slow they drop their blood pressure even more, then there's obviously risks of things like their heart stopping. And so the process is really carefully done, and the amount of sedative that you give an animal is dependent on its mass. So you tend to weigh the animal first, where you have a very, very large tripod. If you imagine a camera tripod, about I don't know, 5-6 times larger than your average camera tripod that's made out of really reinforced steel, and you have a big winch, and you actually, when the animal's still in the net, you can lift the animal off the floor, and you weigh the animal, and that gives you an indication of how much sedative you're able to put into the animal to keep it sedated. So, as I said, you have all the vets, you have everyone on site, and you make sure that you do everything as quickly and as carefully as possible. So it is a distressing procedure, but it's as just little distress as possible. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for talking us through that, Will. I think it's a big event. As you said, there's a lot of people, a lot of thought, and a lot of science going into just catching them and making sure that you're doing it as safely and as securely as possible for yourselves, but as well for the seals.
For the animals. Yeah.
So it's really nice to hear that. So just before we wrap up and we let you carry on with your day, could you tell us about the extra applications of your PhD? So, like, can your research be expanded to include other animals, even just these data loggers? Like, can you just expand a little bit before we let you go?
Yeah, of course. Absolutely, it can. I mean, these loggers can be deployed on, the ones I've specifically built could be deployed on other species of seals. They could be deployed on other marine mammals, so whales and dolphins potentially. And the actual devices that I incorporated in this logger are used ubiquitously for other animals as well. So the research questions that I've been answering, things like how do seals move in very fast-flowing tidal currents, that can be that is translatable to how birds move in very fast wind flows. So if you think of things like a soaring vulture or an albatross, let's say, these animals rely on these very fast-moving or very strong wind vectors. And so the stuff we learn about how animals move through fluid environments can actually be applied to how birds move through aerial environments. And similarly, the impact that these renewable energy installations underwater might have, if you imagine a tidal stream turbine is essentially a wind turbine underwater. It works in exactly the same way. It's just the movement of water that turns the blades as opposed to the movement of air. And so the stuff we learn about how seals might be coming into sort of having detrimental interactions with these turbines underwater is analogous to how birds might interact with wind turbines, or bats as well might interact with wind turbines. So there's loads of opportunities to extend this work to other taxa and to other systems. And I guess one of the important things for your listeners to note is that doing a PhD is very specialised, and you do tend to focus extremely heavily on one particular aspect of work, and and that's the part of it. That's the reason for it. You're trying to create novel scientific findings that no one else has ever done before. So necessarily it has to be very specialised. And you're sort of at the end. I always like to think of research or of academia as a funnel. So for any undergraduates listening, you're at the very top. You're on the rim of the funnel. You've got a very broad. You might be studying biology or zoology, and you've got a very broad sort of idea of lots of different aspects. And then as you do a master's degree, you move further down the funnel and you specialise a bit more. And then a PhD, you're right at the very bottom, at the tip of the funnel, and you've got a really focused, small sort of research area. But what you've always got to remember is the work that you're doing is usually very transferable and very applicable to other study systems. And certainly the skills that you learn are very, very easily and widely applied to other areas. So two of the things that I've developed most strongly in my PhD are programming with R, the software that we use to do a lot of our statistical analysis and data management, and also GIS skills, so geographic information systems, so things like mapping, spatial maps, and those two skills in particular. I've developed quite advanced skills in those over the course of the PhD, and those skills can now be used for lots of other things. Indeed, in the seagrass restoration project, I'm using the GIS skills to map some of the seagrass locations that we're working in, and even recreationally as well. So I'm currently going through the process of buying a house, which is quite tricky, admittedly, in the COVID era, but mapping different parts of the house. I'm trying to buy a small holding with a couple of acres of land. So being able to map the house is useful even just for recreational purposes as well. So don't underestimate how useful a PhD can be for other things as well.
I think that is an excellent note to end it on. Hannah, have you got anything else to add?
No, I think that's about it. And I think that is also a great note to end, is a PhD and pretty much anything you do in your life is so many other things than you first expect.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I forgot to say at the beginning, it's a real privilege to be here, and it's great to be able to talk to you guys about my work. So thank you for having me on.
No, you have been such a pleasure of a guest, and thank you so much for giving us your time today. I wish you all the best of luck with your Viva later on this month.
Yes, good luck.
And yeah, thank you, listeners, for listening. But yeah, I hope you all have a wild day. Bye.
Bye.
See you guys.
Thank you for listening today. As always, we have been wild about conservation, and you have been awesome. Please do leave us a review. We would really appreciate it, and we do read them all.
To keep exploring with us, drop us an email or find us on our socials. All the links are in our description and the show notes. If you enjoy our show and want to support us, we are also on Patreon. Just £1 a month, 25p an episode, will cover our creation costs, and anything above that we donate to charity. Thank you to those of you that are already helping us to keep creating.
Our chosen charity for this season are the British Divers Marine Life Rescue, who are an organisation dedicated to the rescue and well-being of all marine animals in distress around the UK. Donations will go to training teams of volunteers and maintaining specialised equipment that is vital for their work.
Don't forget to look out for our next episode next Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts. If we aren't there, do let us know.
And remember, step outside and get wild about conservation. Bye!
How do you get wild?
Watching wildlife documentaries.
Wildflower painting.
Diving.
Wild swimming.
Ocean watching.
Rock climbing.
Bird watching.
Listening to podcasts.
Hill walks.
Visiting a wildlife charity.